What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing so well. Today is an amazing day. We're talking about exercise in the brain, part 4, continuing our series on the revolutionary new science of how exercise affects the brain. Today, we're going to be diving deep into depression and the effect that exercise has on depression, both from a bottom-up perspective on the neurotransmitters and neurogenesis of the mind to help us climb out of depression, but also from a top-down perspective, creating connections among the cognitive structures that keep us out of depression. And so I'm really excited to bring that research to you and to bring some really practical advice to anybody who's struggling with depression. And if you're listening right now and there's somebody in your life that you know could use this information to help climb out of a very rough time, whether they're currently being treated or not, please share this with them. The right information at the right time can spur some powerful change to help somebody. Before we get to this awesome show, if you'll indulge me just a couple minutes on a personal note, I am extra excited today about this episode because I'm dedicating this episode to my newborn son, Bennett Maxwell Van Houten. I'm recording this intro on February 9th. He was born yesterday morning at 7 a.m. And I'm super stoked to bring this Defining Dad Bod mission to baby number 2. Gabriel's 3.5 years old, and now we've got a new baby in the house. Let's see if I learned anything from the first time around. If you've been following the show for a bit, you know episode 1 starts with Dad Bod is not your fault. And I talk about all the things that happen when a new baby enters the world and all the changes that happen in dad's body for the biological basis of dad bod. And so you know that my cortisol is going to be high, my testosterone is going down as I speak, and my serotonin's going down with it. I'm excited to be on this journey with you guys and to talk about some of the things that comes out of doing this a second time around. Hopefully I can be an inspiration to you. I wanted to share something kind of personal, but also I think could be inspiring and good to share to the world, especially in a depression show. And so something I wanted to share with you is a personal exercise that I do in my own life and that I'm hoping to share with my boys someday. I've been journaling since I was 16 years old when things were really tough or I had something I was trying to work through. Writing it down somehow helped me to work through those things. And I've been journaling for a long enough time to have tried different journals and prompts in those journals to help me guide my thoughts in a meditative way. Research shows that that can be really helpful to boost positive feelings and can help organize one's thoughts so that you're ready to approach the day with purpose. And before my first son was born, it was a completely self-centered exercise. I journaled about my thoughts. Sometimes things were tough. Sometimes they were prayers. Sometimes they were plans for the future or working through a tough problem. But shortly after we found out that we were having Gabriel, I noticed that a lot of my journaling seemed to be me speaking to my future son. And so I saved a Word document on my computer called Gabriel. And when I journaled something that I wished to share with him at some point or maybe seemed to be a letter to him, I'd paste it into that document. And so fast forward 3.5 years later, I still journal and I'm writing to Gabriel. Someday I'll give it to him. I don't know if it'll be something like at his wedding or if certain pieces of that letter I'll give him when he comes of age as a man, as a ceremony, or maybe when he finds out his first child's on the way. I don't know, but either way, every month I faithfully add to this letter. And when we found out we were having baby number 2 and that he was a boy, I started a similar letter. And I've been adding to that over the past couple months. And so since I'm dedicating this show to my newborn son, and journaling has been scientifically shown to help people come out of depression and to stave off depression, I'm sharing this passage with you. If you'll excuse me, it reads a little bit personal and a little more informal than I usually am on the show. And if that's not your thing, you're welcome to skip ahead 2 minutes to get to Exercise in the Brain Part 4. Here it goes. It's dated September 11th, 2018. We found out you're a boy today. I'm so stoked. Your mama wanted a girl to pass on her femininity to. It seems that her motherhood will be best spent teaching 2 boys how to be compassionate and empathetic while modeling what kind of women they should seek to pursue as men. I, on the other hand, was not keen on the whole girl thing. I grew up with 2 sisters. My mom would say they're easier as children, but adolescent girls are brutal and conniving with all those crazy hormones and sexual independence in my experience. Your mama is actually a grand example of how intense they can be on their parents. Go ahead and ask her about it sometime. I am so excited to be your father, my son. Let me tell you what your name means. In order to understand this fully, you need to know some scripture and how it came to me. When we found out we were having you, before we knew you'd be a man-child, I went and fasted in the mountains to seek your life verse. Your brother Gabriel's verse came from Joshua shortly after he was born. I knew his name already. I was sleep deprived, and I'd envisioned what his name would be and what injunction he would require to accomplish his mission in the world. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord is with you wherever you go. But yours came differently. I didn't know your name. I hadn't even met you yet, and I was not sleep deprived. It was one of the first passages I ever spent time memorizing in my youth. It's the cornerstone upon which all the songs of King David find their strength. It goes like this: Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands with sinners, or sits in the seat of the scornful. For his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on it he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth good fruit in its season, and all of the works of his hands will prosper. That comes from Psalms 1:1-3. And so with that in mind, your name. Bennett is derived from Benedict. It means blessed one, the one upon whom God's favor shines. When the priests of old finished their message for the people, they ended on a prayer, dubbed a benediction, wherein they prayed over everyone with the intent to transfer any virtue or goodwill that they'd accumulated that week to the parish, so that all the works of their hands would prosper, and that God's favor would shine on them. You're blessed, and to be a blessing. Bennett, may all the works of your hands prosper as you walk the path of life you were created to walk, the narrow and difficult way that will lead you beside the river. And that's your middle name. Maxwell, deep water, the spring that flows from the depths of the earth and never runs dry. In Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5, it says the purpose in a man's heart is like deep water. Bennett, you're not just like deep water. You are deep water. The tree of your life is planted beside a river that will never run dry. Your water will help you bring forth good fruit in this world, and others will come to you for the bounty and provision of your spirit. If you dig deep enough, in your own heart and into the law of the Lord. Don't take that as a platitude, by the way. Find out what that really means. Then your well will never run dry. And lastly, our wild last name, Van Houten. Van Houten is Dutch. Houten is the name of a city that's in the middle of a little forest. And to be a Van Houten is to be from the little city in the little forest. And so you can interpret our last name to mean at home in the woods, or the one who makes his home in the wilderness. This means you're a force that can tame chaos and make a home where others can join you. Your hands are calloused from hard, honest work, and you are bravely prepared to take on what comes your way. You find your peace in the place where most people don't go, and in the wild, you'll recharge your soul. My son, I love you. I'm so excited to get to know you and to raise you in the way you should go. Bennett Maxwell Van Houten. Thanks for listening. If you're a little ADHD and looking for an alternative to meditation, to get your thoughts in order, to do something meaningful, and to sift through difficult things, then I'd encourage you to try journaling. It's been a pretty powerful thing for me. Now let's get to part 4 of exercise in the brain and talk about how exercise affects depression from the bottom up and the top down. What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing well. I'm so excited about today's topic. Probably overly excited given the title of the topic. Today, we're covering exercise in the brain, part 4. We're talking about exercise's effect on depression. This is going to be a very powerful show, and I hope it's going to help a lot of people, not only listening, but people that you'll share this with. Because of the psychological issues that we might deal with in our time, depression is the most brutal, in my opinion. And the idea that a consistent exercise regimen could be the most important bulwark against experiencing depression again and again in our lives is a powerful one. But this isn't going to be an anecdotal type of show. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience with depression as a personal trainer of over 13 years, and I'm going to talk about what depression actually is and how it's ailing a large amount of people in our current population. Then we're going to talk about treatment courses that are currently used, both medication and cognitive behavioral therapy, some problems and side effects of those things, and then we're going to tackle the research around exercise and its effect on the brain, specifically with regard to depression. Then we'll tie all that up in a beautiful bow and talk about our recommendations, the Defining Dad Bod recommendations toward staving off depression if you don't want to have depression sometime in the future, or if you're currently experiencing depression, what the exercise recommendations are, both the minimum and maximal dose to make a difference. I hope you're as excited as I am. Let's dive in. First, a story. When I was a young trainer, about 4 years into my training career, I was approached by a mother on the fitness floor, and she said, "Hey, I've been watching you for a while," which as a trainer, you get used to people saying to you. I mean, what else are they going to do when they're on the Stairmaster for like 30 minutes? She said, "I've been watching you for a while, and I've decided you're the trainer that we need in our family." And I said, "Great, when can I start helping you?" And she goes, "Oh, it's not for me, it's for my daughter." And she went on to tell me about how her young girl has wrestled with depression for the last 8 years of her life. This girl was 17 years old, was diagnosed with depression at age 9, and since age 9 had tried all kinds of different medications and was even undergoing electroshock therapy to see if some sort of progress could be made in her suicidal thoughts and her tendency to sleep for 20 hours a day. As I was listening to the mother talk about her daughter's predicament, first of all, my heart kind of broke for the girl because I couldn't imagine during those adolescent years having to deal with the feeling of not wanting to get out of bed, let alone wrestling with the decision whether or not to end my life during my adolescence. But I also remembered some work that we had done in my psychology courses at Vanderbilt University, and one of the things that I remember sticking with me was exercise's effect on depression. Now, at the time, the research was little known, and this was a time when if you went to the doctor with symptoms of depression, they would generally prescribe you some sort of SSRI. The idea that exercise could somehow lift you out of depression was an anecdotal one, even though there was decent research to support it. But until this mother spoke with me on the fitness floor, I had never actually thought about utilizing that research in my practice of exercise. In fact, she taught me a thing or two, as her and her husband were up late one night, desperate to search for anything else that could possibly help their girl, and they stumbled on a large body of exercise research with regard to depression. And she said, "Since then, we've been looking for a trainer who we think would be a good fit for our daughter, and after watching you for a while, we both agree that you're the one." I was apprehensive at first, to say the least. I didn't want to promise these parents false hope because I'd never worked with a severely depressed client, and I told her that. But also, I'd remember all my clients that I'd worked with up until that point, and how their moods all changed, and how they seemed to be more positive people after they'd been exercising for at least 6 to 8 weeks. And whether or not they lost weight or gained muscle or got better at any one particular thing, they always seemed to report feeling better overall. And if by doing what I did best, which was helping people move well, I could help this young girl feel less depressed over time, then I was all for it. And I'll never forget the very first session I met, we'll call her Daisy. She was walking on the treadmill. I introduced myself. "Hey, I'm Alex. I'm the trainer your parents hired, and I'm really excited to work with you today." And she goes, "Whoa, dude, tone it down just a bit. I just got up like 20 minutes ago." Since it was 2 p.m., I decided she'd set the tone for the whole workout, and I spent the time talking to her about what it is that she might enjoy trying in the gym. I'll tell you more about how Daisy and I worked together and what actually happened in her life at the end of this episode. But first, I want to jump into the nuts and bolts of what depression actually is and how exercise might mechanistically help depression. First, I guess, is why we're even talking about this. Well, depression seems to be a huge possible part of the normal human condition. It's estimated that 18% of Americans will experience at least one bout of severe depression in their lifetime, and that will result somewhere in the neighborhood of $26 billion spent in healthcare costs. Even worse, though, is the fact that by the time you've listened to this entire episode, 2 people will have committed suicide in America because of depression. In just a second, I'll read you the symptoms of depression that the American Psychological Association used to classify depressed cases. However, while I'm reading, I want you to also understand that 3/4 of depressed patients are also dealing with some other chronic issue. On that list is pain, anxiety, substance abuse, and even dementia. So as I'm reading the set of symptoms for depression and you think of them as a crushing weight on top of a person, also consider that 3/4 of those people are dealing with some other powerful and difficult things. According to the DSM-5, an individual can be diagnosed with depression if they are experiencing at least 5 or more symptoms during the same 2-week period, and that at least one of these symptoms are 1. Depressed mood, or 2. Loss of interest or pleasure. These 8 symptoms are as follows: depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. 2. Markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day or nearly every day. 3. Significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain, or decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. 4. Slowing down of thought and reduction of physical movement, observable by others, not merely subjective feelings. 5. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. 6. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. 7. Diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day. 8. Recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation without specific plan, or a suicide attempt or specific plan to commit suicide. Now, I know that's a lot of symptoms and it's hard to digest, but consider that in order to be classified as depressed, one must exhibit 5 of those things, like feel depressed, feel a lack of energy, entertain suicidal thoughts, feel guilty, and be reported by friends as generally lacking in movement or interest. That's a lot of symptoms. And consider that there are some people who might feel 1 or 2 of those things. Are they depressed? Well, by definition, they're not depressed, but they certainly are miserable. So the question in psychology and neuroscience has been, what causes depression? What actually is it, since a subjective list of symptoms doesn't actually tell you what's happening on the inside? You might be fascinated to know that the very first theory of what caused depression with regard to modern science came from observing that when patients undergoing tuberculosis treatment actually reported having higher than normal levels of happiness in their life, we stumbled upon what we call the Monoamine Hypothesis, meaning that there was a singular neurotransmitter in the brain that controlled whether or not somebody was depressed. That was in the 1950s, and our understanding of depression has evolved past that. Recent MRI imaging studies have shown that those who are clinically depressed and experience recurrent depression symptoms actually have structural abnormalities in the brain, one of them being a 15% reduction in the mass of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a structure in the brain that regulates learning, memory, and even some emotive properties. And this study suggests that depression is not only an imbalance in neurotransmitters, but also a change in the structure of the brain that makes it difficult for the hippocampus to connect to itself and perhaps other structures of the brain to lack connection to other places as well. If you listen to other shows of exercise in the brain in the Defining Dad Bod Exercise in the Brain series, you know that other structures in the brain lacking connection have also been found in things like Alzheimer's and dementia. The other fascinating difference in a depressed brain versus a non-depressed brain was found when cadavers of those who've committed suicide were investigated post-mortem for BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If you've been following this series for a bit as well, you know that BDNF is the miracle grow of neurons. And so while there have been a lot of studies around the effects of neurotransmitters on somebody who's depressed, like serotonin, for instance, which is the neurotransmitter pathway that pharmaceutical drugs like Zoloft act on, SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, it turns out that neurotransmitter imbalance is only a superficial part of the immediate problem. But underlying the genesis of depression is diminished connectivity of the neuronal tissue of the brain and the diminished ability of the brain to create new connections. In other words, if there's a good answer to helping people who are depressed, or even somebody who's pretty miserable but not clinically depressed yet, it must address the brain's ability to connect different structures of the brain and create new neurons. To beat depression, the brain needs a jumpstart. In his book Spark, Dr. John Ratey is quoted as saying, "At its core, depression is defined by an absence of moving toward anything. We need to trick the brain into coming out of hibernation." Well, that's great, Alex. Thanks for the history lesson and the symptoms of depression. But how do we kickstart a brain that's hibernating? That's a great question. In fact, the 2 widely accepted ways to treat depression in the psychiatric community right now is cognitive behavioral therapy and medication, and sometimes a combination of both. Cognitive behavioral therapy seeks to use a top-down model to help clients develop good habits, to develop good beliefs, and to use that cognition and behavior to slowly shake themselves out of depression. The primary problem with this approach, although it does show long-term benefits for depressed patients, is that there's low adherence to most programs. And on the flip side of the spectrum, is the medication route. Clinicians prescribe antidepressant medications to help patients overcome immediate symptoms, that is, to feel better in the immediate, and that's a bottom-up approach. In cognitive behavioral therapy, it might take 3 months for somebody to come out of depression with perfect adherence, whereas in the medication pathway, things generally happen pretty quickly. And while adherence to medication is generally higher than cognitive behavioral therapy, the problems are side effects and relapse. The possible side effects for antidepressants make them a terrible option for many people. Weight gain, lack of libido, general malaise, anxiety, loss of immune function, and even suicidal thoughts are on the label of just about every one of the antidepressant medications. That's not to mention the things like gastrointestinal discomfort or sleep issues. And so it's possible that one can find a medication that will really help to lift you out of depression, but that medication will carry with it a lot of undesirable side effects. Simultaneously, relapse is a problem with medication, since for many, taking medication helps them in the time that they're taking the medication, but when they discontinue the medication, depression rears its ugly head again. In fact, in a study pitting medication against exercise, the medication group relapsed 52% of the time. So if medication acts on neurotransmitters to create a bottom-up approach to deal with depression, and cognitive behavioral therapy deals with beliefs and behavioral patterns in order to create a top-down approach to dealing with depression, then is it possible to address both with better adherence, lower side effects, and less of an opportunity for relapse? The answer is yes, and if you're listening to this show, you probably already know where I'm going with this. It turns out that exercise tackles both. Without side effects like loss of libido, weight gain, sleep disturbances, and diarrhea, exercise is shown to have a greater adherence than cognitive behavioral therapy and lower opportunity for relapse than medication. The real questions are twofold. 1, why does exercise have such a powerful effect on depression? And 2, why are clinicians not screaming this data from the rooftops? I don't have an answer for question number 2, but I will help you understand how exercise tackles both the bottom-up process that leads to depression and the top-down process that helps us get out of it. This is where things get really sciencey, so hang with me. We're going to talk about neurotransmitters, then we're going to talk about the immediate mood boost of exercise. Then we're going to talk about long-term connectivity and the ability to change the structure of the brain through exercise. And then we're going to talk about the self-reliance of exercise and how that addresses the top-down process. So first, neurotransmitters. In a landmark study titled SMILE, S-M-I-L-E, Standard Medical Intervention versus Long-Term Exercise, researchers found that exercise was just as good as Zoloft at treating depression. Subjects were placed in one of 3 groups. The first group was given a placebo, a sugar pill, to see if thinking that you're taking a pill that helps you with depression actually helps depression. The second group took Zoloft, which is an SSRI, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that affects the serotonin system, the neurotransmitter of the brain that has generally been linked in a simple way to depression. And lastly, the third group was given 30 minutes of intense exercise 3 days per week. After 6 months, both the Zoloft group and the exercise group did better than the placebo group in terms of depression. In other words, both the antidepressant and exercise treated depression well. However, there was no difference between the positive affect reported by the Zoloft group versus the exercise group. In other words, exercise did just as well treating depression over a 6-month period as the antidepressant did, but without the side effects. What's even more powerful about this study, however, is that when subjects were followed up 1 year and 3 years after the study, the exercise group reported a significantly lower amount of relapse than the Zoloft group, meaning that exercise treats depression just as well as Zoloft does over a 6-month period. However, those who treat depression with exercise are much less likely to relapse. In fact, the correlation turned out to be some really nifty numbers. For every 50 minutes of exercise completed by somebody, they experience a 50% decrease in their chance of relapse. I'll say that again, it's worth repeating. Every 50 minutes of exercise somebody does in a week decreases their potential for depression relapse by 50%. Now, math can be kind of tough, especially when you're listening to a guy talk about it. So I've done some quick math for you. A 4-hour-a-week exercise regimen is 240 minutes of exercise. That lets you apply that 50% reduction 5 times. And if your risk of relapse for depression is 50% if you've had it before, then 4 hours of exercise brings your risk of relapse down to 4%. So to recap, exercise treats depression just as well as Zoloft does in the landmark study titled SMILE. However, exercise seems to have a more long-term effect than simply treating depression with an SSRI. And the effect of exercise is dose-dependent on the relapsability of depression, to the tune of a 4-hour workout regimen weekly, decreasing the risk of relapse from 50% all the way down to 4%. There are some caveats to this, however, that I think are important to bring up. First, the Zoloft group reported coming out of their depression faster than the exercise group. Well, how is that possible? Doesn't exercise create an immediate mood boost, Alex, because of endorphins? Yes, you're absolutely right. Those who exercised reported an immediate mood boost. But 5 or 6 hours later, that mood boost was just that, a boost in the immediate. They didn't actually report coming out of depression for 3, 4, and even 5 weeks after incorporating the exercise program, whereas the antidepressant showed a turnaround average of about 2 weeks. So although exercise seems to treat depression well without the side effects of an antidepressant, it does not work as quickly as an antidepressant. The second caveat I think is worth considering is that most SSRIs or most antidepressants act on 1 or 2 neurotransmitters in the brain. And if you've been following the Exercise in the Brain series, you know that exercise acts on serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, GABA, and even cortisol. And so while an antidepressant might affect depression a little more quickly than exercise does, exercise also seems to balance out neurotransmitters across the spectrum, treating not only depression, but also other symptoms as well. For more on that, I highly encourage you to check out Exercise in the Brain Part 1 and 2. Okay, so from a bottom-up perspective, exercise can help us feel better on the same terms as something like Zoloft by addressing the neurotransmitters of the body in a positive way, without side effects, and with a decreased relapse rate. Awesome. But what about this long-term effect? How is exercise creating some sort of top-down process that's allowing these effects to last in the long term? That, it turns out, is like the million-dollar question in psychology right now. But one of the primary reasons lies in 4 very important factors in the brain. We call them neurotrophic factors that create the perfect atmosphere for the increase of neurons. Remember I talked to you about the connectivity issue in brains that were MRI scanned known to have depression. There was a reduction in hippocampus size, but also a reduction in the number of connections that we can see throughout structures of the brain. In order to improve that density and that mass, in order to improve the connection of those structures, more neurons must be produced by the brain. And to produce neurons, you need neurotrophic factors present in the brain that will help those cells proliferate. 4 factors: BDNF, VEGF, FGF2, and IGF1. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF, fibroblastic growth factor, FGF2, and insulin growth factor, IGF1, are all elevated into the brain following an exercise bout. And it seems that regularly bathing the brain in these growth factors increases the production of neurons and therefore increased connectivity in the brain over time. My mom was a gardener growing up. We had a nice little patch of tilled ground, probably 300 feet by 100 feet in the side of the yard. We'd go out together in the beginning of spring and plant our seeds. And then, if it didn't rain sufficiently, we would go out on a regular basis, 3 to 5 times a week, and water our seeds. In the Tennessee heat, if you didn't water your seeds, nothing would grow. But if the soil of the condition was perfect, then before you knew it, you had cucumber plants and corn plants and tomato plants, everything growing just like it should. Similarly, you can think of your brain as a garden. All the seeds have been planted and the structures are there. However, if you don't water it on a regular basis, then you're not going to make the garden grow. And exercise, it seems, is one of the ways that you can water the garden of your brain, so to speak. BDNF, VEGF, FGF, and IGF-1 are all important factors and important nutrients, so to speak, of the water of the garden of your brain. And if you don't exercise, it's going to dry up and none of the seeds will grow. And this is where the garden analogy breaks down, because if I didn't water my mom's garden, it would have died. But in the case of depression, the brain doesn't die, it just stops growing. And the discontinued growth and the reduced connections to other structures of the brain seems to be what drives many of the symptoms of depression. The last study I'll mention today that really drives this home is a study where a researcher took 17 severely depressed patients for which years of therapy had done no help for. They had done electroshock therapy, they'd done a cornucopia of different antidepressants, They'd even used experimental drugs to try to kick these people out of the depressed state. As a last resort, they signed up to be part of an experiment that looked at the effects of exercise on depression. And this study, conducted at the Cooper Institute, put them through a rigorous exercise regimen of brisk walking 55 minutes per day, 3 days per week. In the study, just over half the participants completed the full term of the exercise regimen, but every single one of them lifted out of their depressed symptoms, and 5 of the 17 original subjects achieved full remission and never relapsed into depression again. The researchers asked the question, why was the last resort exercise, when perhaps it should be the first line of defense? I mean, is it really that hard to incorporate 3 one-hour walks into your week? And it's my observation to add that it's not for lack of time that we don't do this, especially since people are spending way more than 3 hours a week on social media or other screens. I think the most powerful part of this study, however, is that in these individuals, they had tried nearly everything that science currently understands in medicine to shake their depression. And it wasn't until they incorporated exercise into their daily routine that their depression symptoms not only lifted, but in some of them left them completely. So to recap, depression's a big problem, to the tune of almost 1 in 5 people dealing with it at least once in their life, and 3/4 of those people dealing with other things, anxiety, pain, dementia, the list goes on. And we're still understanding what actually causes depression. But as far as we know from a scientific perspective, depression seems to be a lack of connectivity in the brain, with the hippocampus losing quite a bit of mass and volume, and other structures of the brain showing a lack of connectivity as well. The current treatment of depression generally takes the tune of either a bottom-up process of medication, which could result in side effects and relapse, or a top-down approach of cognitive behavioral therapy, where there's relatively low adherence compared to the medication. Now, exercise addresses both the bottom-up process of helping you feel well via neurotransmitters and the top-down process of increasing long-term connectivity between the neurons, even to the tune of helping others for whom every other treatment didn't work. So in order to take away the big message in Exercise in the Brain Part 4, let me tell you a little bit more about my client Daisy. I knew that Daisy would not enjoy exercising. I mean, if I felt fatigued, I was overweight, and I had tried everything to get out of my depression and was sleeping till 2 p.m., I wouldn't really want to get out of bed and exercise hard either. So for our first several sessions, I kept her company while she walked on an incline treadmill, and we talked about the things that she was interested in, like her collection of superhero action figures and a few of the video games she was currently playing. After a few sessions, she mentioned the desire to move like the character in her Ninja Gaiden game. And so the structure of her workouts became 30 minutes of brisk walking while we talked about the things she was interested in, and then we spent 30 minutes practicing what we called our ninja moves. We had a blast balancing on Bosu balls, throwing medicine balls back and forth, doing cartwheels and forward rolls, and kicking bags. After 3 months of seeing her 3 times a week, I called her parents to ask if we'd seen an improvement and got to speak with her psychiatrist. Both parties told me that she had improved significantly in the time that we'd been working together. She seemed more upbeat, she was going to bed earlier and waking up earlier, and she seemed almost excited about going to her workouts. But the real difference came when 3 months in the start of our workout, walking on the treadmill, talking about her recent acquisition of a superhero action figure she'd been looking for. She looked me in the face and she said, "Thanks, Alex." And I said, "What for?" And she said, "I haven't told anybody this, but I haven't really thought about killing myself for about 3 weeks now, and that's the longest time I can remember since I was a kid." Now, I don't know what you're dealing with or what kind of treatment options you or your loved ones might have sought out in order to improve your depression or the depression of those around you, but I'm going to recommend exercise as a first line of defense as well as a last resort. And though we don't understand completely why exercise seems to outdo medication and cognitive behavioral therapy in terms of both improved mood and decrease in relapse, we do have some numbers around the minimum amount of exercise and the maximum amount of exercise that seem to make a difference. So minimally, 30 minutes a day, 3 days per week of walking at a brisk intensity can make a positive impact on depression symptoms. However, a program like that has 2 goals. 1, consistency. And once consistency is established, then 2, the number of minutes in a week need to be increased to 5 or 6 days a week for 30 minutes a day. And then finally, greater intensities should be achieved in an exercise program like that. Once you're at 6 days a week for 30 minutes a day, then one should attempt to incorporate 1 to 2 high-intensity workouts in there. That could be the difference between walking around the block versus walking on a Stairmaster, or trying another modality, like running, swimming, rowing, cycling, or even an exercise class. But going to the other end of the spectrum, the question is how much exercise is too much? Because one could exercise themselves right into depression if they overdo it. And that limit seems to be measured in amount of calories per body weight. So to know the maximum amount of exercise one should do if they're trying to stave off depression symptoms, or perhaps postpone a relapse or keep one from happening completely, then you should multiply your body weight in pounds times 8. And that's the total number of calories you should seek to burn through exercise in a week. Any more than that, and you're riding the limits of what science understands is good for depression with regard to exercise. For instance, I weigh 165 pounds. If I multiply that by 8, that's 1,320 calories that I should burn in a week as my maximum amount of exercise to stave off depression. In my world, that might be 6 30-minute high-intensity bouts, or 2 slow 1-hour bouts with 2 high-intensity bouts in between. Whatever you do, when incorporating exercise into your world to help with depression, I have 4 tips for you. Start small. If you're not currently exercising, then any form of exercise for any amount of time is better than you're doing right now. And remember, these impressive studies that show a decrease in symptoms for the long haul weren't doing anything spectacular. 30 minutes a day, 3 days a week of a walk is not that intense. 2. Be consistent with your program. Remember, exercise isn't as effective as medication in the short term. It'll take 3, 4, maybe even 5 weeks for you to experience an overall decrease in symptoms of depression when you add exercise into the mix. So it's important that you're consistent even before you see results. This happens to be also what I preach to somebody who's working on weight loss as a goal. Consistency in exercise is how we lose weight in the long haul. And so those first few weeks are the most difficult when you're doing the work, but you're not quite seeing the results yet. Hang in there and stay consistent. My 3rd tip for you is find a workout buddy. Since at its core, depression seems to be a problem of connectivity in the brain, it also seems to manifest itself in connectivity with other human beings. You can do your exercise in a social place, like boot camp, for instance, or a run group. But even if you don't do social exercise, having a workout buddy will help you stay consistent and will help to encourage you through those weeks where you're not seeing the results yet. And my last tip, studies show that starting a new exercise program is significantly more effective if you have somebody supervising you and helping you stay accountable to your goals in the program. Personally, I've committed my life to helping people when they want to start a workout program, to program it in a way that builds on itself so that they don't get injured, but also gives them a progressive way to feel more and more accomplished every single time they work out. It's also been my passion to ensure that they stay motivated and supported in their goals, because we all do better when we have someone in our corner. So if you're hesitant about using exercise to help you with depression symptoms, or you know somebody in your life who's struggling with depression, but they don't really know where to start with regard to exercise, I encourage them to get help with that program. You can find my resources for getting started at definingdadbod.com/trial. I'd be happy to be a first step to point you in the right direction. Daisy was an important client to me. She taught me the power of exercise to physically and psychologically lift herself up and others. And to this day, I still keep in touch with her via social media, and I'm happy to say that as long as she's exercising, she doesn't relapse. Just a few weeks ago, I did a show reviewing the results of a recent life expectancy study done in the United States, and I talked briefly about the power of exercise to influence depression and suicide. Those listening at the time might have thought of it as a platitude, but I hope that in listening to this particular episode of the Defining Dad Bod Show, you have a better understanding how exercise addresses neurotransmitters, immediately boosts mood, and increases the ability of the brain to create long-term connections that'll decrease the symptoms of depression. I don't want to say that the answer to depression and suicide is simple, but I do want to say when you have a simple solution that could be monumentally beneficial with very few downsides, then why don't we start with that? Next time somebody brings the life expectancy problem to you and talks about depression and suicide, I hope you'll refer them to this show. And I hope that a large number of this generation of young people will start to find their way out of depression through a simple and consistent exercise program. And if you yourself don't struggle with depression, but you know someone who does, invite them to be a part of your exercise program. Go for a run on Wednesday mornings together, lift weights on Friday, and play Frisbee on the weekends. Who knows? you might be helping them change their brain for the better. This has been Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names.